Welcome everybody to the book launch of this marvelous time, the new social contract. My name's Jane Hume, I'm Senator for Victoria, and I'm joined today by the author of this marvelous book, Tim Wilson, who's down there, and also by the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, and by Julian O'Connell too, who is the Office of the Vice Chancellor of ANU. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm hoping that everybody has a copy of this marvellous book in front of them. I've been in quarantine for 12 days now, and quite frankly, it's what's got me through. It's been my guiding light. So thank you very much, Tim, for making sure I had a copy before we settled in. And it's such a beautiful book, and it really does remind us all in these very difficult times about why we're here and what we're here to do. You know, one of the quotes that got me in there was that Menzies pointed out that the universal appeal of a political movement can only be realised when people can see their own lives through the values and aspirations projected. And that's exactly what this book leads us on that journey. So without further ado, my job here is to moderate, but also to introduce the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, who's going to say a few words. Josh.
Well, thank you very much, Jane, to you, to Julian, to Ryan Bolger, great to see you, to David Kemp, to the Contrarian there, John Roscombe, to Greg Craven, to Damien Freeman, who has helped put the book together, and of course to the self-described non-believing cultural Anglican himself, Tim Wilson. Thank you, Tim, for the wonderful invitation to launch this book. I really appreciate it, and it's the book is a real credit to you. Well, friends, from his time as a Human Rights Commissioner to a crusader on franking credits, Tim Wilson has always been busy with a purpose and busy with a plan. And the new social contract is no different from that. It's a very important book. It's a thought-provoking book. It's full of ideas, and it's a call to arms to those who believe in liberalism, those who believe in liberalism's past, its present, and of course, its future. It's also a continuation of a theme that Tim kicked off in his first speech to Parliament, where he talked about being frustrated by small politics stifling our ability to tackle the big challenges. And it's a theme that I can see running right through this book. Like any good doctor, Tim Wilson has diagnosed the problem, but he's also prescribed the solution. Now, when it comes to the problem, in this book, Tim talks about what he terms popcorn politics, where consumer culture has taken over a belief and the practice of a philosophy in one's politics. He talks about little morsels of puffed ideas as opposed to any intellectual nutrition. And he makes the comment that as far as a nation goes, you can't live on a diet of morsels of puffed ideas. You need something a lot more substantive than that, and that is absolutely right. He also points, though, as a result of the consumer culture and the way that politics has developed, that we've seen the rise of what he terms the Socialist Populist. And we're talking here about the Corbyns and the Sanders, who believe that everything should be free. Free tuition, free housing, and don't think about the costs to future generations, particularly in terms of the debt burden. And Tim, I think, rightly points out that even though Corbyn and Sanders were not successful in the end at the ballot box, their ideas are actually gaining greater currency. And he says that here in Australia, we've been protected somewhat by our record run of economic growth, which, as you know, has come to an end now with the COVID-induced recession. But he says we're heading in Australia for a quiet revolution, not pitchforks at Bunnings, but a revolution ultimately at the ballot box. And Tim does a lot of analysis in this book where he points out that there is a demographic change, a generational divide that is occurring. And I thought it was really interesting how in the book he pointed to, I think it was an ANU electoral analysis, which said at the last election, for people over the age of 55, 18%, there was an 18% increase. Actually, the number of voters for the Liberal Party was 18% higher in that age bracket than it was for the Labor Party, which was the highest that it's ever been recorded. By the same token, he points out that for those who are under 35 years of age, only 23% went to the Liberal Party at the last election compared to nearly 50% back in 2004. So I think what Tim has done very effectively in this book in using primary source data is to analyse the challenge and the problem, and he calls it in fact a crisis that is facing liberalism. And then he sets up solutions. And he's right to point out in this book that liberalism as the dominant philosophy in the 21st and the 20th century certainly points to all the victories in the 20th century, but as the dominant philosophy with its focus on opportunity, the individual and freedom is very well placed to fight back. But he says it's important that people recognise that the goalposts have actually changed and that it's no good to play defence anymore. You've got to play offence. And he cites a whole lot of historical figures and great intellectuals like Abraham Maslow with his hierarchy of needs, and he goes even back to Richard Pipes and his quotes on and his observations on the French Revolution. But ultimately what Tim does is he goes back to the founder of the Liberal Party, Sir Robert Menzies. And Menzies' term about homes human, homes material, homes spiritual. And Tim points to the absolute importance of home ownership and property ownership to the concept of liberalism. And this is where I think Tim has prescribed a very powerful solution to some of the problems that we are seeing. It's one certainly that I sign up to and our government signs up to. But if you think back to Margaret Thatcher, she always talked about every earner being an owner and the importance of home ownership. And Tim provides that philosophical underpinning for home ownership in this book, where he says basically, if you're a homeowner, you've got an interest in the status quo. You're interested in preserving and conserving the present. Whereas if you've got nothing to lose, then you've got nothing. You certainly don't. You don't think about preserving the status quo, and I think it's very important. So what Tim does in the book is he talks about the challenges around home ownership, about supply and demand. He talks about the importance of environmental regulation. He talks about the importance of tax changes, and obviously the one he points to is stamp duty and being effectively a transactional tax on people when they move homes. He also talks about the superannuation system, pointing out the irony that we're forced by law to save for our retirement, but that means that people are prevented from buying the one big asset in their life that will help them in retirement, namely a home. And I think Tim again points out some of the relevant statistics about declining home ownership and the increasing cost of home ownership in Australia. And I think one of the really interesting statistics there is as a proportion of people's income, the cost of someone's home has more than doubled in the last 30 years, and it's obviously taking a lot longer to pay back. So I think what Tim has done with this book is provided an intellectual base for the thinking about modern liberalism. He's diagnosed some of the challenges that liberals are facing, particularly the generational divide and the rise of the Socialist Populist. But at the same time, he's provided a pathway forward with a focus on home ownership as being absolutely critical. But as Tim points out with one very nice anecdote in the book, that where he was door knocking in Jolimont, he came across a nice terrace house, I think it was, with rose bushes and the like, and he turns up at the front door, and the woman is complaining to him about how one of her family members can't afford a home in the nearby area, but in the same breath, she's telling Tim how she opposes more development in the area. So, you know, the inconsistency about opposing development, but also wanting housing affordability is a very obvious one. So, Tim, congratulations. I think it's a very important book about liberalism, about the challenges that liberals and the movement of liberalism faces. He does point out, though, and I think rightly, that not all followers of the Liberal Party are all followers of liberalism, or vice versa. But there is obviously a very strong correlation. Not everyone will agree with everything that Tim has said in his book. He talks about decentralisation. He talks about consumption taxes. He provides a pretty stinging critique of conservatism as well. But ultimately, I think Tim has given us real food for thought with this book. And he's pointed out a key difference between adherents of liberalism and those adherents of social democracy. Thank you, Tim, for putting together a really important book. I hope it gets well read by many people, and it's certainly got some things in it that I strongly support you on, and hope to implement with you and Jane as part of the Morrison government. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you so much, Josh. That was terrific. At one stage, you and I are going to have to compare dedications in the front of this book and see if Tim has said the same thing to both of us, because I think that you took the kernel of all of the messages that are in this book, and there are many messages, and you've described them very well indeed. So without further ado, my job now is to introduce the brash young man himself, Tim Wilson, who was one of the first people that I met in the Liberal Party, and what a baptism of fire that was, to find somebody that was such a sort of an intellectual powerhouse, so extraordinarily articulate within our ranks, was truly inspiring. And it's, of course, it's natural that he would run for the seat of Goldstein, where there is a history of the great intellects of the party that have been members and of both the party and also representative members beforehand. Particularly, I'm thinking, of course, of David Kemp, but I also tip my hat to Margaret Fitzherbert, also the author of 2 books on Liberal women, who is a member of Goldstein. And now you have continued that great tradition, Tim, and I congratulate you again. So over to you to tell us a little bit more about the new social contract.
Well, thank you very much, Jane, but can I start particularly by thanking Josh so much for launching this book. The reality in politics is when a backbencher writes a book, they're never going to write things that everybody in the government is going to agree with, because what they have is the freedom and the privilege to say what they think and not be bound by cabinet solidarity. And in practice, this book, as Scott Morrison himself describes, prods and stirs, and it was written exactly for that purpose. But it was written because what I wanted to do was focus on the long-term challenges of liberalism as a political idea and what that means in contemporary Australia, and to really shape a framework of thinking. And one of the things that I wrote, or why I wrote it, was because I could see heady days ahead, particularly as we move towards 2030. But of course, what the coronavirus has done, and we've all lived through, is brought that period forward. And I can go through why, but it has meant that governments that I thought might have had to face some big challenges in 10 years may be facing them in a much shorter time frame. And Josh, you and the government have obviously had to face those directly as a consequence of COVID-19. And what we need more than anything else is foresight and a forward-looking liberalism that understands these challenges and stewards the country. And that's exactly what you've done throughout the past months, in particular during this crisis. And the fact that you were able to take some time out in your very busy schedule, particularly in quarantine. I think this might be the first book launch where all three of the the MC, the person who's launching the book, as well as the author, are all in quarantine in different places. The fact that you've been able to take the time out and honour your commitment to do this is very much appreciated, because it provides, obviously, a stature to have somebody such as yourself launch it, but obviously to make sure to carry the point that there are ideas in this book that ruminate and hopefully will inform your thinking about how you look about some of the challenges that we're going to face. So thank you so much, Josh. Jane, to you, thank you also so much as well for taking the time. Intergenerational equity is actually core to your portfolio. And of course, the importance of having a system or a society where people are able to retire with dignity through superannuation is a critical part of the social contract that does exist in Australia. Now, how and that social contract operates and whether it needs renewal is obviously something that's going to be critically important, as I outline in the book. But the fact that you made the time for an hour during your busy schedule at this time is also greatly appreciated, and particularly for hosting it remotely and getting through some of the technical challenges as well. Also to Julian, who will be giving the vote of thanks at the end. Thank you, and Michael Casey and Damien Freeman from PM Glynn Institute, who've been instrumental in this book. The whole point of the book is really to talk about the future of the country, in understanding the ideas that will prod our nation and where it will go over time. And of course, there have always been challenges that countries have faced. There will always be issues that come up from time to time. But when you look back at the history of Australia, and I go through sections of it throughout the book, there's always been a social contract, an understanding about the expectations, about what people expect from society to be able to live out their aspirations and their lives. And Josh correctly quoted Sir Robert Menzies about the importance of values and how values have to be something that a population need to see their lives lived through if political movements are to be successful. And the concept of a social contract, whether you go back and look at Jean-Jacques Rousseau or Hobbes or John Locke, all talked about this important relationship between citizens and each other, but also about citizens to government and how what they can expect as somebody who wants to be able to go out and live their lives. But I think Edmund Burke's analysis of the idea of the social contract, of an intergenerational equity between those living, those who have come before, and those yet to come, has really informed a lot of my thinking about the type of society and a good society that we should want to create, not just for ourselves today, but what we would want and hope to pass down to future generations. The idea of understanding that we are, of course, we seek to aspire things for ourselves, but that we are also stewards and have a respect for the environment, for the economy, and handing prosperity to future generations to live better lives than ourselves, a cohesive society that understands our common bonds and is mutual, respects our mutualism and obligation to each other as part of what is ultimately a good society. But I foretell in the book and go through quite extensively why I think that faces some very real and big challenges that we must confront. If you look at the practical reality of voting behaviour and the attitudes that divide different demographic groups in our country, particularly by age, and we're not alone in this, it paints a challenging picture that Niall Ferguson has started writing about as well. The historian Niall Ferguson from Harvard University has started writing about as well, where he talks about the coming generational war. Now, I don't believe in a coming generational war, but I do believe that if we don't address some of the big challenges we face, that we can end up in what I call the soft revolution of the ballot box. Because the issues that younger Australians face, who are now the largest demographic group voting-wise in the country, 18 to 35, are at times in direct diametric opposition, or certainly conflict or tension, with baby boomers over the age of 65. And that one of the ideas of the social contract is that it does need to renew, to reflect changing attitudes in societies at a time. But if we go back to those principles of being stewards, it's also about having a united society. And when people talk about generational conflict, they talk about tension, it suggests that we're not getting the balance right, because it shouldn't be about one generation versus another. It should be about a continuum where everybody can see how they're able to live their lives through the institutions and the contract that provides the foundation for our society. And so what this book challenges Australian politicians, myself, sometimes even I found myself prodded and stirred by what I was writing, was how to do that, and to look analytically at what are the foundations of having an open society for Australians to be able to realise all parts of their aspiration in their life. And what it identifies more than anything else, when I've gone through the data and a lot of the research, is that more than anything else, you will always have divides between the young and the old in terms of attitude. You'll have it because younger Australians, as is the same in the UK or the United States and many other societies, have little to gain, and so consequently constantly pursue opportunity in society. They want the opportunity to get a good education, a good job, to be able to have a family, and of course to buy their own home. And of course, at the other end of people's life cycles, and we've never had as many older people as we have right now, is people want security. They want security for themselves, their health security, but also, of course, critically, as we discussed extensively at the last election, financial security too. And so somehow we have to build the bridge between the aspirations of young Australians and the expectations, and justly, of older Australians, the two largest demographic groups, to keep society together and to ensure an environment and culture of mutual respect. And you may only notice in recent days, attached to discussions around the COVID-19 pandemic, where there's a lot of discussion about how older Australians are best impacted by the health consequences and younger Australians by the economic consequences, that almost every single issue today has a deeply generational component to it. So how do we smooth any tension that exists there, particularly because COVID-19 will have brought these challenges forward? Currently, we're in a health crisis, but we know that what will follow is an economic crisis. As Josh correctly outlined, we've been brought into a COVID-induced recession. But after recessions, there are also debates about the balance and who got the benefit and the consequences and shoulder the burdens thereafter. And that often breeds political crises. And what this book partly foretells is the risk of a political crisis now brought forward. And our task as Liberals, as stewards, as people who want to bind our country and build a sense of national cohesion and opportunity, is to smooth over those divides so that every Australian can be able to realise their full opportunity. Now, if you look at the US and the UK in particular, and I draw reference to things like Corbyn and Sanders, in the post-GFC world, that's their political crisis. The challenge for us now is, of course, that we may have one directly stemming from this economic crisis. And so when you look at the diametrically competing interests of generations, it raises a number of issues for Australia, particularly around tax and the superannuation system. And one of the points I make, looking at a lot of the research that's done in Australia, particularly by bodies like the Productivity Commission, among others, is that there's clearly competing interest in how the tax system is structured and what we're favouring. Things like income from labour and intellectual energy versus income and growth from capital, and what's favoured and what's not. The consumption taxes, rightly or wrongly, are the most intergenerationally equitable, because and there's some really good research that shows this, particularly from the Productivity Commission, but it's just simple logic. The consumption taxes aren't just fair because people pay them at the point of consumption, but because, unlike most other taxes, people pay it across the whole of the stages of their life. And of course, what that also leads to is discussions more broadly about what we should do of rebasing the tax system to make it more sustainable, to not create a sense of class or interest in the structures of our society. And to go back to one of the points that Josh made, and I say this, it isn't an attempt to make a stinging critique of conservatism, but to simply outline what conservatism is. I said in my first speech it was a virtue, but it wasn't a vision. The competing visions of our country have always been between a social democracy and a liberal democracy. They're the directions. Progressivism and conservatism is ultimately about the speed in which you want to get there. And what Menzies pointed out in his understanding of liberalism and extolled was a forward-looking modern liberalism, because it reflected the ambition of building a liberal future. And one of his critiques, particularly about conservatism in the context in his time, and I go through his exact words at the time, is an opposition to a class-based society. He always called it the false war, but not just between capital and labour, but between different other sections of society, between the well-off and those who are less well-off, and of course, the forgotten people, the middle class. But if you look at the challenges and the potential class structures that could create today, because of things like the tax system, because of things like the entrenched interests that come with certain legal structures, and some of the demographic challenges we face, where one of the most clearest ways that younger Australians are in a position to be able to buy their own home is based on whether their parents were able to do so themselves. We don't want a class-based Australia. We want a society that is open. We want an economy that is open, where every Australian can realise their full ambition. And so addressing one of the most fundamental, what I call conversion points that occurs between a younger Australian seeking opportunity and wanting to conserve and secure what they have is home ownership. So fighting for young Australians to be able to own their own home is critically important. And this is not a new discussion, as going back to the point about Menzies and particularly in 1949, I recommend people go and read the Museum of Australian Democracy has election speeches back all the way for the opposition leaders and the prime ministers. And of course, that was the election where Menzies came to power. And if you look at the speech that was given by Ben Chifley at the time, he talked about the importance of Commonwealth state housing agreements and what he was able to do in encouraging, inspiring, or enabling Australians to be able to rent their homes. And what Menzies did in comparison, and it was core to what his political philosophy was about the idea of the home and the foundation, the building block with family that it creates for the strength of the country and for a nation where people take pride in themselves and in the interests of the nation, was home ownership. And my argument is that not much has actually changed. The irony of the new social contract is actually, I think a lot of it has stayed the same. But it's a time where we have to renew this discussion and put a much greater emphasis on these issues, because if we fight for home ownership for the next generation of Australians, we fight for the future of our country. And that is the message I want to convey through this book, and how to address some of the issues of intergenerational equity that confront our country to build a stronger Australia. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining, and we're going to have a Q&A session if people want to submit their questions. But before we do, I just want to again thank you, Treasurer, so much for joining the call and being a participant from quarantine, and to you, Jane, as well. Thank you so much. But also to some other people who provided inspiration, like David Kemp and John Roscombe. And of course, I also want to give particular thanks to some of the people who made comments about the book and were kind enough to have themselves associated. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. Frankly, I think it's pretty risky for a Prime Minister to offer comments on a book from a backbencher who's been so free-thinking as myself in the past, in the present, and I suspect for some time in the future. but also to Troy Bramston, who isn't traditionally associated with our party, but he obviously is one of the preeminent biographers of prime ministers, and he wrote an exceptional, I think, biography of Sir Robert Menzies only a couple of years ago, which Josh Frydenberg himself launched, and I was there when he did so, and it was an excellent book. And so his contributions appreciated. For Amanda Vanstone for offering a critical perspective around why it's important to have politics based on ideas rather than pursuing the issues of the day. And Russell Howcroft, again, somebody who probably is a bit atypical for a political book, but understands the power of culture and what informs culture and then shapes it. Because that is ultimately about what this book is about. It's not just about policy proposals. It's actually about a shaping of how we should see our country and the opportunity we should be presenting for future generations and respecting the security that older Australians need in pursuit of united culture. And of course, finally, thanks to my wonderful husband, Ryan Bolger, who always supports me and had to sit through a lot of me writing this book at the expense of our free time. But also finally, again, to Greg Craven and Michael Casey and Damien Freedman and Julian O'Connell, have all, through the PM Glynn Institute, have, particularly Damien, who edited the book and had to take my musings and at times turn it into something frankly coherent, particularly against the backdrop of a very busy parliamentary schedule, and to constantly have to deal with me hang up when I was in meetings and then get back to him in phone calls later. I say in the book that he is the archetype of what could be aspire to be part of Australia's Bunyip aristocracy as one of the Lords of the North Shore. But he has been a fantastic contributor and offered incisive critiques, as I've written in the book, to make sure I get it right, that there aren't errors, but more critically to reflect from probably a more conservative standpoint about my perspective and my views. And so I welcome that very much, and I want to say thank you very much to all of them. Thank you.
Good.
Tim, I might, at this stage, wave Josh Frydenberg goodbye. Thank you very much for joining us, Treasurer. Ironically, he's off to a meeting with the Master Builders Association to talk about the next generation of homeownership. And can I also, just before you go, Josh, please let everybody know that this is a very special day for Josh, because it is, in fact, his 10-year anniversary since being elected. So what an honour it is to have him along at your book launch today, Tim. We'll let you go, Josh. Have a good day.
Thanks, Jane. And Tim, congratulations. And I commend the book to everybody who's on the call. Very well. Thank you.
So we might then kick off with some questions. And I don't know whether this is cheating, Tim, but I actually thought that I might start with this issue of home ownership, which is such a really important one. You know, the quarter-acre block really is the the great Australian dream, but it's changed so much just in the last couple of decades or so. And you're right, we've seen home ownership rates decline quite dramatically, but it's more than the great Australian dream. You think it's part of the great Australian buy-in to the status quo. Is that right? Can you expand on that a little bit further for us?
Yeah, I can, and that's right, Jane. I do think it is part of the great Australian dream, which is a romantic notion, but it's also one about the idea that it's very closely connected to the idea of equality of opportunity. It doesn't matter who you are, where you're born, or your circumstances, that you can, through hard-earned living, put yourself in a position where yourself and your family can have ultimately what is all but the most important part of security. And as we're discussing at the moment, is the most important part of security, particularly as you age, but also to create the environment for security in the immediate sense for the family, but also, of course, to intergenerationally help your children have a better start to life than yourselves. But it is important to understand that it has a socio-political benefit that is so much greater. And I talk about it going all the way back to reflections on the French Revolution, where it was reflected upon the fact that one of the reasons why peasants ultimately revolted is because they had no investment in the status quo. They didn't own anything. And therefore, when a system is unjust and gives people no sense of aspiration about what they're able to realise, they have no reason why they don't believe in breaking the status quo to create a more just future for themselves, their families, and for their country. And in fact, what I argue is that this is one of the fundamental problems behind the rise of socialist left politics and socialist populism in the United States and the United Kingdom. And I worry may occur here, is you have young people saddled by debt who fear for their future, who don't have an investment in the status quo, and nor do they feel they have the potential to have it because they see that gap. And Josh quoted the number before, since the 1980s, the income ratio to home ownership, a home was 4 times the value of the median income. And today it's 9, and in some places of the country it's 11. So it's more than doubled. That they increasingly see as unrealisable aspiration. So if people don't see the value in being able to pursue their lives through the existing economic order, social order, political order, ultimately they will have no interest in conserving it, and they will have an interest in breaking it to recreate a more just future for themselves, their families, and society. And that is ultimately what I believe we've seen through Sanders and Corbyn, is young people, and all of their manifestos are squarely focused on young people and these types of grievances, not just housing, but particularly housing, as part of how they want to recreate society. And the challenge I have, and one of the reasons why I draw such a clear distinction between liberalism and conservatism, is if we just conserve what we have without trying to create a pathway for people to have a greater future through a liberal ideal, a country of ownership, then all you'll ultimately have is to be dragged towards a socialist alternative. And that's not what I'm prepared to tolerate. The foundation of why I got into politics and the values that you and I share and Josh shares, and I think and would hope everybody in the Liberal Party shares, the uniting values that are the foundation of our party, is very much of a unity and a sense of purpose where every person can live out, see the aspiration to live out their lives through what we offer. And that's our task. And that's our challenge, and one we can meet.
It certainly is a big challenge indeed, but I think if anybody's up to the task, it's some of the heavyweight minds like yours in our party room. So there's a lot of questions that are coming through on the screen now, and if anybody wants to ask additional questions, they can use the Q&A function on their Zoom. I'm going to run through a couple of them now. Here's an interesting one. I won't be able to recognise names of all the questioners, but this one has come through from Bridget Materia, who says, Tim, what would Rousseau have to say about your new book?
Well, we had slightly different worldviews on some matters, but I think what we find common ground on is a concept of justice. And I think this is one of the important discussions around liberalism. Liberalism, and one of the points I make looking back at the past 30 years, is there's been a very big focus on freedom. And you know, I'm not averse to that myself. I was dubbed the Freedom Commissioner when I was appointed Australia's Human Rights Commissioner, as you know. But liberalism isn't just about freedom. It is, but it's part of a concert of other values around responsibility and also of justice. And I think what we need to do in looking at some of the tension, I've had a conversation with the great David Kemp about this, is that there's always been a tension between freedom of the individual and empowerment of the individual in liberalism. And I think he would at least have some regard for, probably wouldn't agree with my perception on justice, but the need to have a discussion around justice. And the observation I make very strongly in the book is over the past 30 years, because we've focused so much on the freedom of the individual, we've almost forgotten how to be, I guess almost say, fit for the discussion around justice and what that means in a society. What does a fair day's work and earnings mean? How should we, what's a just tax system? And I say that very deliberately because is a system or a tax system that favours some interests, and particularly growth and income off capital versus income off labour, one that's just? And my argument is, I don't think it is. I think you need to have a much more flat tax system across the board. So no matter where you are and how you earn your income and how you get your benefits, that there is some degree of respect for people regardless of their stage of life. Because particularly looking at the thesis of the social contract that needs renewing at the moment, young Australians mostly only have their labour to sell, whereas of course older Australians primarily have assets that they've rightly and justly accumulated over their lives. but equally shouldn't be given any preference as a consequence.
There's a question here from Grant Holland saying, Tim, COVID-19 has seen the world turned upside down. Some future changes we know, like the nature of work, but there will be some changes that we have no idea. What do you think are going to be the major social, economic, political changes in the future?
Well, Grant, that's actually an excellent question. And my point is, I actually don't think we've seen the world completely turned on its head. I think we've got to separate out what we're going through at the moment, particularly around the measures in the pandemic. And, you know, I suspect a lot of people on the call are from Victoria, so you're all living not dissimilar to experience the ones we're living in Canberra at the moment while we're in quarantine. But they're momentary, like the economic measures, so the lockdown measures, or at least they better be. But what it's actually done has led to the future being brought forward on a lot of these economic challenges, particularly around intergenerational debt, which we all understand why there's been a shift and a change in that, but in public debt and who carries the cost and who's getting the benefits of the cost. But also around the challenges in the tax system. And there's a particular report that was done a few years ago looking at the Productivity Commission, which looked at the tax and transfer incidence in Australia. And I think it's one of the most interesting reports that's been produced in recent years, looking at who pays what. Most people focus on the front, which was on taxes share of things like income, but it actually does a really interesting analysis in it on the tax system and the transfer system and how it applies to intergenerational equity and who pays what at what stage of life and who gets what benefit at what stage of life. Now, a lot of the conclusions from it aren't particularly revolutionary. They go back to the discussions that Peter Costello led in discussions around the intergenerational reports when he produced them. But what it highlights, of course, is that all of the areas of increase in public expenditure are going principally towards older Australians, if we take the COVID-19 recession out of it. None of this should be interpreted as a criticism of older Australians, just a reflection on some of the facts, which is where are the biggest areas of expenditure growth generally, particularly in terms of those given to the population. We could go through a long discussion about defence policy, but that's not relevant to it, is in the areas like pensions and aged care, and particularly healthcare costs, which are the most expensive at the latter stage of your life, and for entirely legitimate reasons, because people are facing challenges around comorbidities and chronic illnesses, which also leads to the pharmaceutical benefit scheme and increasing costs there. But the tax and transfer system currently puts most of that cost on to young Australians while saving for their own retirement security. So can you have a society that's sustainable and that's intergenerationally just, that doesn't acknowledge some of those tensions? And it's not to somehow radically change things to demonise one section of the community or the other. That's not the objective. It's how do you make it sustainable so that everybody can do so? So the discussions around spending have to be very closely associated with discussions around tax, because in the end, they're actually really about responsibility.
There are a number of questions that have come up that have a very similar theme, and that's around the increasing divide between those in the old generations that have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, and those in the younger demographics that are progressively moving away from voting for the Liberal Party. And the questions are around how we bring those voters back into the fold. What can we do in the immediate term and in the medium term to bring those voters back into the realm of liberalism?
Well, it's an excellent question, and that's really the core conclusion of much of the book, which is more than anything else, what there needs to be is a much more a clearer focus on the importance of home ownership, and that the current government is absolutely focusing on home ownership. I need to make that crystal clear. The minister does so. As you said, the Treasurer's just gone off and had a meeting with the master builders precisely on this topic, and one that I encourage. But I think it needs to be a much clearer focus as part of the product itself we offer, that it should be something we absolutely and resolutely champion, because if you get young Australians to be able to buy their own home and to form a family, you get, and there's actually research out of the United States from the Reason Foundation, from a report, I think it was in 2015, that looked specifically at what shifted people's voting behaviour. And what it showed very clearly is that the primary conduit that shifted people's voting behaviour was whether between the period before they owned a home and the period after they owned a home, and of course the associated benefits, including for their family. So I think that's got to be a critical part of the discussion. It's not the only issue, and I don't suggest it is, because sitting behind these issues of intergenerational equity are discussions like climate change that need to be discussed as well, and of course economic responsibility and intergenerational debt. So I think it's all of those, but ultimately for young Australians to want to vote in a particular way, for a liberal democracy, and obviously I have an interest in them voting, particularly in a partisan sense for my party, we've got to make sure that that's crystal clear and that they see us as championing that, because if we champion that, we are championing them and their aspiration for themselves and for their own futures. So I think that's the critical linchpin in driving this discussion, because if you don't, you very well may see what was already an unfortunate trend, which I make the point, and Josh mentioned it before, in 2004, it was just shy of 50% of Australians under the age of 35 voted for the Liberal Party. At the last election, it was at 23%. But that's a consistent trend with other countries. A YouGov research paper in the UK described age now as the primary determinant of people's voting behaviour of the past 3 UK elections, for the very simple reason it is.
Well, in the same vein, there's a number of questions that have come up around, those personalities of the left in other countries. In particular, Jeremy Corbyn has been referenced many times.
Yep.
Can you see the rise of a personality of the left, like a Corbyn, like a Sanders, in Australia, and what the effect of that might be? Would that disrupt the move towards regaining the hearts and minds of younger Australians?
Well, I think it's important to understand that there's a big difference between the personality and the substance. It's ironic that you had all of these millennials voting for unreconstructed socialist baby boomers in the UK and the US, which show that it's not really about personality. It's actually about ideas, and particularly around what the product that was being offered by those individuals. And one of the critical points I make in the book is that just because those candidates were defeated, and they were, it doesn't mean that the cause and the issues that inspired them and got others to go out and mobilise for them have disappeared. They haven't. And so do I see a particular individual in Australia doing it at the moment? No. But I also don't think we're at that point yet. It took 6-7 years before there was a real mobilisation of those types of political figures in US politics. It was no doubt seeded before that, but it took a while. We're at the start of an economic crisis, which hadn't we had COVID-19, I still think would have come political crisis in about 10 years. And now I think it's probably closer to about 5 years. So do I see an individual? No. But politics is actually about who seizes on moments and movements and how they can build up political constituents to achieve it. But what I think my biggest concern is it's got nothing to do with individual political leaders. It's that the solutions that the socialists offer are false and don't actually address the underlying problems that young Australians face. And I don't want that future for our country. And the solution to these problems is a more liberal future that respects individuals and their enterprise and a reward for their effort, so that they can go out living their own life. There was an excellent book written by a Conservative MP in the UK, a guy called David Willett, who wrote a book, The Pinch. And he used a pretty derogatory title, which is how baby boomers stole millennials' future and why they should give it back. I don't agree with that, but he made the point that young Britons, as the same in young Australians and young in the US and elsewhere, is they fundamentally want exactly the same thing they've always wanted. And they're entirely consistent with our values. So let's make sure the product we offer connects directly to what they want, so they have every interest and every aspiration to never look down the dark road of the socialist alternative and make so many of the errors that society's made throughout the 20th century in the 21st.
Tim, we probably only have time for one more question, but there's a few that again are on a similar theme. Obviously, books take a very long time to gestate, and Neil McConaughey and a number of other people have asked, when did you first start getting the itch to write this book, and how long before you actually started writing it, and how many times did you start it and put it away and pick it back up again?
Good question, Neil, and others. So I actually started writing it in my mind about a decade ago, and it was purely off some observations I made in my own circumstance. And I don't want to suggest that I have any. It was a hardship case, but it was when I was trying to save for my own home, and I was looking at the attitude of others, particularly those who did own their own home, and particularly those who had done so for a long time, about the challenge of doing so. And what I discovered very quickly was that I couldn't save, even though I had a good job, at a rate fast enough to catch up to growth. And it prompted me to start thinking about exactly these issues. Now, I own my own home with Ryan today, so I don't, nothing in this book, to be frank, benefits me. Just to be clear, I don't get any gain from it. I'd actually probably end up having a completely different outcome for myself. But what it would do is lead to that opportunity that at that time I was seeking. And so that's when it started. And I've started and stopped and collected evidence. And that's whatever opinion people may have on the different policy proposals. It's been collated over about that decade, but really it started being written formally in the past couple of years, as I realized that, and this was obviously pre-COVID-19, that the moment had come to make some clear statements on exactly these issues, because as much as anything else, as you know, Jane, I'm an absolutely proud, unabashed liberal, and I want to see liberalism as an idea and a value system for our country, not just survive, but thrive. And to do so, sometimes you have to diagnose the problem and get other people to see the world, perhaps, and some will disagree, through the lens in which I'm seeing it, and why it's so important to confront. Because it's not just about a sustainability of a partisan movement, though there might be part of that as a discussion. It's actually about the survival of the type of country we have, and I think we want, and the type of country we want to be.
Tim, that's, I think, a perfect spot for us to leave our Q&A there. Tim, congratulations on this wonderful book. You have stood on the shoulder of intellectual giants in the past, and you're now reaching further for the stars. I disagree with you, though. I think that there is a lot in here for you as well. It's not just part of a legacy, but it's also a manifesto, which is something that is so important for our party. One of the things that Robert Menzies said, that one of the best things about our party was the lively minds and forward-looking hearts of those involved, and certainly you have you have all of that in spades, and I'm so proud to serve alongside you. Congratulations again, Tim. Can I encourage everybody out there that hasn't bought a copy of this book yet to do so? It's a fascinating read. You'll love every minute of it. And of course, there's something else in it for Tim. At least he'll get some royalties there. So with that, thank you very much for all of your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them all. And thank you very much for joining us on this wonderful book launch today. Congratulations once again, Tim.